There are moments in life that split your world right down the middle. Before and after moments that change everything you thought you knew about people, about courage, about what really matters. What happened at Rosie's truck stop that scorching July morning in 2023 was one of those moments, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all these months later. Let me start from the beginning, because this story, hell, this isn't just a story, it's a damn revelation. This needs to be told right, with all the pieces in place. Because when I walked into Rosie's that morning at 6:30 sharp, coffee hungry and running late for my shift at the county courthouse, I had no idea I was about to witness something that would shake me to my core and restore my faith in humanity all at the same time. Rosie's truck stop sits at the junction of Interstate 95 and Route 17, about 40 miles south of Richmond, Virginia. It's one of those places that's been feeding truckers, travelers, and locals since the Eisenhower administration. All chrome and neon and red vinyl booths that have seen more conversations than a priest's confessional. The walls are covered with trucker memorabilia, CB radio chatter from the 70s, and faded Polaroids of regular customers who've been stopping by for decades. But the thing that always caught my attention wasn't the vintage Peterbilt hood ornament or the signed photo of some country singer I'd never heard of. It was the corner booth by the big windows overlooking the truck parking area. That booth belonged to Earl Morrison, and everyone in 3 counties knew it. At 71, Earl was what you'd call a fixture. Every morning, Monday through Friday, he'd shuffle in around 6:15, order the same breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, crispy bacon, black coffee, and sit in that corner booth reading whatever paperback western he'd picked up from the gas station rack. Earl moved slow these days, leaning heavy on a walking cane that had seen better decades, his left leg dragging just slightly from old injuries that nobody talked about much. Most folks saw Earl as just another old-timer killing time, nursing his coffee and living in the past. He was quiet, polite, always said yes ma'am to Rosie, and left exactly 15% tips counted out in small bills. His clothes were clean, but worn. Flannel shirts from Sears, work pants that had been washed 1,000 times, boots that had walked more miles than most people drive in a year. But there were things about Earl that didn't quite add up, if you paid attention. Like the way he always sat facing the door, his back to the wall, the way his eyes tracked every person who walked in, cataloging faces and movements with the precision of a security camera. The way he kept his coffee cup in his left hand, leaving his right free and ready. Little things that most people missed. But I'd been a court bailiff for 15 years, and you learn to read people in that job. Earl never talked about his past, never mentioned family, never joined in when the regulars got to swapping stories about their glory days. He'd just sit there with his Western novel, occasionally glancing up at the morning news playing on the TV above the counter, his weathered face giving nothing away. What I didn't know that morning, what nobody knew except Earl himself, was that he was carrying secrets that would make your blood run cold and your heart swell with pride, all at the same time. I'd grabbed my usual corner stool at the counter, close enough to Earl's booth that I could hear him quietly talking to Rosie about whether the Nationals had any chance of making the playoffs this year. Rosie Martinez, 60-something with steel gray hair and hands that had been making coffee since Carter was president, had a soft spot for Earl. She always made sure his coffee stayed hot and his eggs were cooked exactly right. "Mornin', honey," she said to me, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Usual breakfast?" "Just coffee today, Rosie. I'm running behind and Judge Morrison's got a full docket." Earl looked up at the mention of Morrison. "You work for Judge Morrison?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl that I'd never noticed before. 23 years come September, I said. "You know the judge?" Earl's eyes went distant for a moment. "Know of him. Heard he's a fair man. Treats veterans right in his courtroom." Before I could ask how Earl knew about Judge Morrison's reputation with veterans, the morning quiet was shattered by the rumble of motorcycle engines. Through the big windows, I watched 6 Harley-Davidsons swing into the parking lot, their riders taking their sweet time, dismounting, stretching, making sure everyone knew they owned whatever space they occupied. The patches on their leather vests read, "Satan's Disciples MC, Virginia Chapter," and even from a distance you could tell these weren't the weekend warrior types who cosplay as outlaws on Sunday rides. These men had the lean, dangerous look of predators who'd learned their trade in places where violence was a currency and weakness was a death sentence. The leader was a piece of work, 6'3", maybe 250, with a shaved head covered in tattoos that told stories I didn't want to know. His vest read Razor below the club patch, and when he walked, it was with the swagger of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with his fists, or worse. Behind him came 5 others, each one looking like Central Casting's idea of a biker gang nightmare. There was a skinny guy with dead eyes and facial scars that suggested he'd survived encounters that would have killed smaller men. A mountain of muscle with hands like ham hocks and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. 3 others who moved with the casual menace of men who'd done hard time and learned to take what they wanted. When they pushed through the door of Rosie's, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Conversations died mid-sentence. The handful of truckers at the counter suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. Even the morning news seemed to get quieter. Razor surveyed the restaurant like a general planning a conquest, his cold eyes taking in every face, every exit, every possible threat. When his gaze landed on Earl sitting quietly in his corner booth, something ugly flickered across his features. "Well, looky here," Razor announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "Somebody's grandpa's taking up the best seat in the house." Earl didn't even look up from his book, just turned a page real slow and took a sip of his coffee, calm as Sunday morning. That reaction seemed to piss Razor off even more. He strutted over to Earl's booth, his boots loud against the worn linoleum, his crew spreading out behind him like wolves surrounding prey. "Hey, old man," Razor said, leaning over the table. "You deaf or just stupid? I'm talking to you." Earl finally looked up, and I saw something in those gray eyes that made my blood run cold. Not fear, hell no. It was the look a man gets when he's done suffering fools and calculating how much trouble something's worth. "I heard you," Earl said quietly, his voice steady as a rock. "Just didn't figure you were talking to me since I don't answer to disrespect." Razor's face went purple. "Disrespect? You think you deserve respect, you broken-down old cripple? Look at you. Can't even walk without a cane. What the hell did you ever do that earns you respect?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Earl set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, marked his place in the book with a napkin, and slowly looked up at Razor. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried an edge that could cut steel. "Son, I've earned more respect in a single day than you'll see in your whole miserable life. But respect isn't something you explain to a man who doesn't understand it. It's something you show." That's when Razor made his first mistake. He laughed. "Show me?" he said, grabbing Earl's walking cane and tossing it across the restaurant where it clattered against the cigarette machine. "What are you going to show me, Grandpa? How to fall down?" Earl's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Just sat there looking at Razor like he was studying a particularly unpleasant bug. "Pick up my cane," Earl said quietly. "Or what? Or you'll regret not picking it up." Razor looked around at his crew, grinning like this was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. "Boys, I think Grandpa here is threatening me," he turned back to Earl. "Let me tell you how this works, old man. This is my restaurant now. These are my roads. And you're going to show me some goddamn respect or I'm going to teach you what happens to old fools who don't know their place." That's when Razor grabbed Earl's coffee cup and hurled it against the wall where it exploded in a shower of ceramic and hot coffee. Then he swept Earl's breakfast off the table with his arm, sending eggs and bacon and toast scattering across the floor. "There," he said, looming over Earl. "Now you got nothing, just like you are. Nothing." Earl stared at the mess on the floor, then at his walking cane lying across the room. His hands, I noticed, weren't shaking. They were steady as surgical instruments, resting flat on the table like he was getting ready to push himself up. "You made a mistake, son," Earl said, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. Yeah? What's that? You assumed I needed that cane to walk. Before anyone could blink, Earl Morrison was on his feet. I'm telling you, it was like watching a magic trick. 1 second, he was a frail old man who could barely shuffle to the bathroom. The next, he was standing straight and tall, his shoulders squared, his posture military perfect. The limp was gone, the shuffle was gone. What stood facing Razor was a man who looked like he could march 20 miles with a full pack and still have energy left to fight. Razor's grin faltered. What the hell? The cane isn't for my leg, Earl said, taking a step forward. Razor, all 6'3" and 250 of him, actually took a step back. It's for my knees. 38 years of jumping out of perfectly good airplanes tends to wear on the joints. But my legs work just fine when they need to. The skinny biker with the dead eyes moved to flank Earl, but Earl's head snapped toward him with lightning speed. I wouldn't, son. I'm talking to your boss right now. Your turn comes after. Something in Earl's voice, something cold and final, froze the skinny guy mid-step. Razor was trying to regain control of the situation, but you could see the doubt creeping in. So what? You're some kind of tough guy? Some wannabe badass? Earl smiled, and it was nothing like any smile I'd ever seen on his face before. This was the smile of a man who'd seen the elephant, danced with the devil, and lived to tell about it. No, son, I'm not a wannabe anything. I'm the real deal, and you just poked the wrong sleeping dog. That's when Earl did something that made my jaw drop. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a faded photograph, and set it on the table where everyone could see it. The photo showed a much younger Earl Morrison in military fatigues, standing in what looked like a jungle clearing. But he wasn't alone. Standing next to him, arm around his shoulders, was a man I recognized immediately, even though he was 50 years younger in the picture. It was Judge Morrison, my boss, the man I'd worked for every day for 23 years. Judge Morrison is my son, Earl said quietly. And this picture was taken in 1971, outside a place called Firebase Charlie in South Vietnam, 3 days before I earned this. Earl reached into his shirt and pulled out something on a chain around his neck. When it caught the light, every person in that restaurant sucked in their breath. It was a Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor. The highest decoration for valor in combat that this country can give. There are fewer than 70 living recipients, and I was looking at one of them sitting in a truck stop diner, being threatened by some 2-bit motorcycle gang wannabe. But Earl wasn't done. Not by a long shot. You want to know what I did to earn this? He asked Razor, whose face had gone pale as milk. I held off 2 companies of North Vietnamese regulars for 6 hours while my unit evacuated wounded from an overrun firebase. Lost my entire platoon doing it. Killed 47 enemy soldiers with rifle fire, grenades, and when I ran out of ammunition with my bare hands and a K-bar knife. The restaurant was dead silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. When the dust-off choppers finally came, Earl continued, they found me unconscious in a pile of enemy bodies, covered in blood. Most of it not mine. I'd been shot 4 times, had shrapnel in both legs, and a bayonet wound that went clean through my shoulder. But I was still breathing, and every one of my boys who could be saved made it out alive. Earl took a step closer to Razor, who now looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. So when you ask me what I ever did to earn respect, Earl said, his voice rising for the first time, the answer is I bled for it. I killed for it. I watched my friends die for it. And I've spent the last 52 years living with the ghosts of men who didn't make it home, because I have to justify every day why I got to live, and they didn't. Razor was backing up now, his crew shifting nervously behind him. This wasn't how the morning was supposed to go. They'd come in looking for easy marks, people to intimidate and shake down. They'd found a goddamn American hero. But Earl still wasn't finished. "You want to know what really earns respect?" he asked. "My son, that judge you probably don't know from Adam. He runs the only veterans court in 3 counties. Every week he sees young men and women who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan broken and lost, struggling with demons you couldn't imagine in your worst nightmares. And instead of throwing them in jail, he gets them help, treatment, second chances." Earl's voice cracked slightly. "Because he grew up hearing stories about what war does to good people. Because he understands that sometimes the strongest among us need a hand up, not a boot to the face." The big biker with the ham-hock hands was fidgeting now, looking anywhere but at Earl. The others were shuffling their feet, probably wondering how fast they could get to their bikes. But Razor, to his credit or his stupidity, wasn't backing down yet. "So what?" he snarled. "That was 50 years ago, old man. This is now. And now you're just another broken-down has-been taking up space." That's when the door chimed again, and everything changed. The man who walked into Rosie's truck stop looked like he'd stepped off a Marine Corps recruiting poster. 6 feet tall, built like a middleweight boxer, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore jeans and a polo shirt, but something about the way he moved, precise, economical, alert, screamed military. When he saw Earl standing confronted by 6 bikers, his expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Something that suggested Razor and his crew had just walked into a whole different kind of trouble. "Morning, Earl," the newcomer said calmly, walking over to the booth. "These gentlemen giving you trouble?" Earl's face broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in 3 years. "Nothing I can't handle, Marcus, but I appreciate you asking." Marcus. The name clicked in my memory. Marcus Webb, recently retired Marine colonel, now running the Veterans Outreach Program for the county. I'd seen his name in the court files, recommending treatment programs for veterans who'd gotten sideways with the law. "You boys might want to rethink your approach here," Marcus said to Razor, his voice conversational, but carrying an undertone that could freeze hell. "This man is Earl Morrison, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, and he's got more friends in this county than you've got brain cells." Razor was trying to process this new information, but he was committed now, backed into a corner with his crew watching. "I don't care if he's George Washington himself," he said. "Nobody disrespects the Satan's disciples." Marcus nodded like that made perfect sense. "Fair enough. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to Earl. You're going to clean up the mess you made. You're going to pay for his breakfast and coffee, and then you're going to leave and never come back. Or what?" Marcus smiled, and it reminded me of a documentary I'd seen about great white sharks. "Or I'm going to explain to you why the Marine Corps spent $4 million on my education in applied violence." The skinny biker with the dead eyes decided he'd had enough. "Come on, Razor, this is bullshit. Let's just go." But Razor's pride was wounded now, and wounded pride makes men do stupid things. "Fuck that," he snarled. "Nobody tells the Satan's disciples what to do." He swung a haymaker at Marcus's head, putting all his weight behind it. Marcus moved like liquid. He stepped inside the punch, caught Razor's wrist, and twisted. There was a wet, popping sound, and Razor screamed. In one smooth motion, Marcus spun Razor around and drove him face first into the table, pinning his arm behind his back at an angle that made everyone in the restaurant wince. The big biker with the ham-hock hands reached for something in his jacket, but Earl moved faster than a man his age had any right to move. Suddenly that walking cane was in his hands. When had he retrieved it? And the knob end was pressed against the big man's throat with enough force to make him gag. "I wouldn't," Earl said pleasantly. "These old reflexes, they're unpredictable. Might accidentally crush your windpipe." The other 4 bikers froze, looking at their leader face down on the table and their biggest enforcer being held at cane point by a 71-year-old man who'd apparently been faking frailty for years. Marcus leaned down close to Razor's ear. "Here's what you're gonna do," he said conversationally. "You're gonna apologize to Earl, loudly and sincerely. Then you're going to clean up this mess. Then you're going to leave $300 on the table, enough to cover damages and lost business. And then you and your crew are going to ride out of here and never come back to this county." "Go to hell," Razor gasped through the pain. Marcus applied a little more pressure to the arm lock. Something else popped, and Razor screamed again. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you clearly. Could you repeat that?" "I'm sorry!" Razor shouted. "I'm sorry, okay? Just let me up!" "Sorry to who?" "Sorry to Earl. Sorry to the old man. Jesus Christ, let me go!" Earl stepped back, releasing the big biker, who stumbled away, rubbing his throat. Marcus held Razor for another few seconds, then released him with a shove that sent him stumbling into his crew. Razor clutched his injured arm, his face red with pain and humiliation. "This isn't over," he muttered. Earl stepped forward, and suddenly he didn't look like anyone's grandfather anymore. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd killed 47 enemy soldiers in single combat and lived to tell about it. "Yes, it is," Earl said quietly. "Because if I see any of you in my county again, if you so much as drive through here on your way to somewhere else, I'm going to make some phone calls. And you really don't want me making phone calls." "What kind of phone calls?" the skinny biker asked. Earl smiled that shark smile again. "Well, my son the judge has a lot of friends in law enforcement. My friend Marcus here has a lot of friends in federal agencies. And I know some people who don't exist on any organizational chart but take a dim view of American citizens who threaten American veterans." The silence that followed was broken only by Razor's labored breathing and the distant sound of a semi-truck air brake. "Now," Earl continued, "you're going to clean up this mess, leave that money, and get out. And if I were you, I'd find a new line of work, because word's going to get around about what happened here today, and I suspect you'll find that respect you're so worried about getting harder and harder to come by." What happened next was almost anticlimactic. Razor and his crew cleaned up the spilled food with napkins from the dispenser, muttering apologies under their breath. Razor counted out $300 in 20s and 10s, his injured arm making the task awkward and painful. And then they shuffled out of Rosie's like whipped dogs, their Harleys sounding less like thunder and more like defeat as they rode away. The restaurant stayed quiet for a long moment after they left. Then Rosie started clapping. Slow at first, then faster, until every person in the place was applauding. Earl looked embarrassed by the attention, waving his hand dismissively. "Ah, hell," he said. "Just wanted to finish my breakfast in peace." That's when the real story started coming out. Turns out Earl Morrison wasn't just any Medal of Honor recipient. He was the Earl Morrison, the ghost of Firebase Charlie, as the history books called him. The man who'd single-handedly held off an entire North Vietnamese battalion for 6 hours, buying time for the evacuation of nearly 200 wounded American soldiers. But more than that, Earl Morrison was the reason Judge Morrison had dedicated his career to helping veterans. Growing up, the judge had watched his father struggle with what we now call PTSD, but what they called soldier's heart back then. He'd seen the nightmares, the drinking, the years of silence about what happened in that jungle clearing in 1971. Marcus Webb wasn't just some random Marine who happened to walk in at the right time. He was the son of Staff Sergeant Robert Webb, one of the soldiers Earl had saved at Firebase Charlie. Robert Webb had made it home, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 children, including Marcus. When Robert Webb died of cancer 5 years ago, his last request was that his son find Earl Morrison and thank him for the life he'd been able to live. Marcus had been looking for Earl for 3 years when he took the Veterans Outreach job in our county. He'd known Earl lived somewhere in Virginia, but Earl had changed his name after the war, trying to escape the attention that came with the Medal of Honor. It wasn't until Marcus saw Earl's picture in a local newspaper article about longtime diner customers that he'd finally tracked him down. But here's the part that really got to me. Earl hadn't been limping and using a cane because of his war injuries. He'd been using them as a disguise, trying to blend in, trying to be invisible. Because Earl Morrison had spent 52 years trying to live a quiet life, haunted by survivor's guilt and the weight of being called a hero when all he could remember were the friends who didn't make it home. The walking cane? It was made from a piece of debris from Firebase Charlie, carved by Earl himself during his long recovery in the military hospital. He carried it not because he needed it, but because it reminded him every day of the cost of his survival. Over the next few weeks, the story of what happened at Rosie's spread throughout the county. Earl, despite his desire for privacy, found himself something of a local celebrity. Veterans from 3 states started making pilgrimages to meet him. High school history classes took field trips to hear him speak. The VFW post made him their honorary commander. But the real change was in Earl himself. For the first time in 5 decades, he started talking about the war. Not the heroic parts that made it into the citation for his Medal of Honor, but the human parts. The fear, the loss, the weight of command when you're 22 years old and responsible for keeping men alive in hell. Judge Morrison started joining his father for breakfast on weekends, and I'd see them talking quietly in that corner booth, working through years of silence and misunderstanding. The judge told me later that he'd never really understood why his father had been so remote, so reluctant to talk about his service. Now he knew that Earl hadn't been hiding from his family. He'd been protecting them from the darkness he carried. Marcus Webb became a regular too, and the 3 of them, the Medal of Honor recipient, the judge, and the Marine, formed an unlikely friendship based on their shared understanding of service and sacrifice. As for Razor and the Satan's disciples, well, that's where the story gets really interesting. About 2 weeks after the incident at Rosie's, I was working late at the courthouse when Judge Morrison called me into his chambers. Sitting across from his desk, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, was Vincent Razor Carrera. But this wasn't the same swaggering bully who'd terrorized a truck stop. This was a broken man, his arm still in a sling, his face bearing the weight of some terrible revelation. "Tell him," Judge Morrison said quietly. Razor looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected. Shame, deep and genuine. "My real name is Vincent Morrison," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm the judge's nephew, his brother Tony's boy." The room went dead silent. Judge Morrison's brother Tony had been killed in a car accident 15 years ago, along with his wife. Their son Vincent had been in and out of foster care, juvenile detention, and finally prison. The judge had tried to help, but Vincent had rejected every offer, every attempt at reconciliation. "When I heard about what happened at the truck stop," Vincent continued, "I didn't know who the old man was. I just knew some war hero had humiliated me and my crew, so I did some research, trying to figure out how to get revenge." He pulled out a manila folder and set it on the judge's desk. Instead, I found this. Inside the folder were photocopies of military records, newspaper clippings, and official documents spanning 50 years. The story they told was staggering. Earl Morrison hadn't just saved Marcus's father at Firebase Charlie. He'd saved Vincent's grandfather, Tony Morrison's father, Sergeant First Class Michael Morrison, who'd been wounded in the same battle. Michael Morrison had made it home, married, and raised 2 sons, one who became a judge, and one who died too young in a car accident, leaving behind a troubled teenage son. Vincent's voice cracked as he continued. "My grandfather died when I was 8. But before he died, he used to tell me stories about a man who saved his life in Vietnam. A man named Earl who carried him 2 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his back. He said Earl Morrison was the reason I existed, the reason our whole family existed." Judge Morrison was staring at his nephew with something between shock and profound sadness. "Vincent, why didn't you ever tell me you knew about Earl? Why didn't you—" "Because I was angry!" Vincent exploded, then caught himself, lowering his voice. "I was angry at you, angry at the world, angry at God for taking my parents. And when you tried to help me, all I could think was that you had everything, the career, the respect, the perfect life, and I had nothing. I didn't want your charity." Earl Morrison chose that moment to walk into the chambers, having been called by the judge. When he saw Vincent sitting there, his expression didn't change. but something shifted in his posture. "Judge Morrison asked me to come down," Earl said quietly. "Said there was something I needed to hear." Vincent looked up at the man he'd tried to humiliate, the man who'd earned his Medal of Honor saving Vincent's own grandfather, and broke down completely. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were. What you'd done for my family. I'm such a piece of shit. I'm everything that's wrong with this country, everything you fought against." Earl studied Vincent for a long moment, then did something that surprised everyone in the room. He sat down next to the young man and put a hand on his shoulder. "Son," Earl said gently, "you're not everything that's wrong with this country. You're proof that this country can produce good men who lose their way and find it again. Your grandfather would be proud of you for coming here, for owning up to your mistakes." Over the next hour, Earl told Vincent stories about his grandfather that no one else had ever heard. Stories about Sergeant Morrison's courage under fire, his loyalty to his men, his determination to make it home to his family. Stories that painted a picture of a man Vincent had only known as a sick old grandfather, but who had been a hero in his own right. By the time the conversation was over, Vincent had made a decision that would change the rest of his life. He was done with the Satan's disciples. Done with the anger and the violence and the waste of everything his grandfather had died for. He wanted to make something of himself, to honor the legacy of the man who'd carried Sergeant Morrison to safety all those years ago. Judge Morrison, with the help of Earl and Marcus, arranged for Vincent to enter a veterans treatment program, even though he'd never served himself. The program was designed for family members of veterans dealing with intergenerational trauma, the kind of damage that gets passed down when heroes come home broken and can't talk about what they've seen. Vincent threw himself into the program with the same intensity he'd once brought to running with the motorcycle gang. He got clean, got sober, and started working with other at-risk youth who'd grown up in the shadow of military families. But the real transformation came 6 months later, at the annual Veterans Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Earl Morrison, who had avoided public appearances for 50 years, had finally agreed to participate in the ceremony honoring Medal of Honor recipients. Judge Morrison and Marcus Webb were there, of course, but so was Vincent, clean-cut, wearing a suit, carrying a wreath to place at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The ceremony was beautiful and solemn, with veterans from every conflict since World War II in attendance. But the moment that brought tears to every eye came when Earl was introduced to speak. He walked to the podium slowly, leaning on his walking cane. Not for show anymore, but because his knees really were giving out after 7 decades of hard use. When he looked out at the crowd, his eyes found Vincent sitting in the front row next to Judge Morrison and Marcus. 52 years ago, Earl began, his voice carrying across the hollowed ground, I was a scared 22-year-old kid who found himself in a situation no amount of training could prepare him for. I did what I had to do, what any man would have done in my position. I brought my boys home. He paused, looking directly at Vincent. But the real heroes aren't the ones who perform miracles in combat. The real heroes are the ones who come home and build families, raise children, contribute to their communities despite carrying wounds that never fully heal. Men like Sergeant Michael Morrison, who taught his grandson that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid. Earl's voice grew stronger as he continued. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage is admitting when you've lost your way and asking for help to find it again. The young man sitting in our front row today is proof that redemption is possible, that the values we fought for, honor, courage, commitment, can be reclaimed no matter how far we've fallen. When the ceremony ended, Vincent approached Earl with something in his hands. It was a leather jacket, not the Satan's disciple's vest he'd worn that day at Rosie's, but a plain brown leather jacket that had belonged to his grandfather. Sergeant Morrison wore this home from Vietnam, Vincent said, holding it out to Earl. I want you to have it. You gave him a life to live after the war. Now I want to live a life that honors both of you. Earl accepted the jacket with hands that shook slightly, not from age, but from emotion. Your grandfather was a good soldier, he said. "But more importantly, he was a good man. You've got his blood in your veins, son, don't you forget that." That moment, watching a Medal of Honor recipient accept a gift from the reformed gang member he'd helped save, surrounded by a judge who dedicated his career to helping broken veterans and a Marine who'd spent years searching for the man who'd saved his father, that moment crystallized everything I'd learned about courage, redemption, and the bonds that tie us together as Americans. The story didn't end there, though. Vincent Morrison went on to start a nonprofit organization called Second Chances, focused on helping at-risk youth from military families. Earl Morrison became his unofficial advisor, sharing stories and wisdom gained from 7 decades of life. Judge Morrison expanded his Veterans Court program to include family members affected by military service. And Marcus Webb? He left his government job to work full-time with Vincent's organization, bringing his military expertise to bear on the problem of helping young people find their way back from the edge. As for Rosie's truck stop, it became something of a pilgrimage site for veterans and their families. Rosie framed the $300 Razor had left that day and hung it on the wall next to a new photograph. Earl, Judge Morrison, Marcus, and Vincent standing together outside the restaurant. 4 generations of the Morrison family legacy united at last. Earl still comes in for breakfast twice a week, still sits in that corner booth. But now he's rarely alone. The booth has become an informal meeting place for veterans, active-duty military, and their families. Stories get shared, problems get solved, and connections get made over coffee and eggs. I stop by sometimes when court's not in session, just to listen to the conversations. Last week I heard Earl telling a young Marine just back from Afghanistan about the importance of asking for help when the nightmares get too bad. The week before, I watched him counsel a Vietnam veteran's widow about how to handle her husband's long-delayed PTSD diagnosis. And every conversation starts the same way, with Earl Morrison looking the person in the eye and saying, "Respect isn't something you take, it's something you earn. And sometimes earning it means admitting you need help." That's the lesson I learned that scorching July morning at Rosie's truck stop. That heroes come in all shapes and sizes, that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand up for what's right, even when you're outnumbered 6-1. Because at the end of the day, that's what America is supposed to be about. Standing up for each other, lifting each other up, and never forgetting that we're all in this together. And if a 71-year-old Medal of Honor recipient and a reformed motorcycle gang leader can find common ground over breakfast at a truck stop, well, maybe there's hope for the rest of us too.